Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Young, and I'm doing a series of videos, and I wanted to expand a little bit on GDP and relate this GDP analysis to balance of payments, because two statements are constantly made by the opposition parties. One is the shrinkage in GDP. The other aspect that they talk about is the deficit and balance of payments, which basically is another area I'll get into specific details. Basically, they're using negativity to push their agenda to basically say that Stephen Harper's policies are not working in terms of supporting GDP growth, or as well as the balanced payments in terms of the cash flow inflows and outflows into the country. If we're in a deficit position, then we're outflowing more cash outside the country, and I'll get into specific details into that. But in essence, they're trying to use these negative hits to basically to sell their economic platforms. But the problem is it's a very dangerous game unless you go into specific details of policies that will trigger the impacts required to close those gaps, whether they are growing GDP or whether they're looking at expanding exports or whether they're looking at closing that balance of payment gap. I'll go into specific details that trigger this to try to keep it at a basic level for those people who are not economics experts, but they kind of want to understand how their role fits into this and how government policies will drive it. So what is GDP? In a nutshell, it's a total value of goods and services that a country produces. Okay, it's basically how you measure yourself in relationship to your peers. When you hear of it, basically when we look at GDP in terms of understanding whether we're in the growth period, stagnation, we look at changes. If we see two successive quarters where we see negative growth, based on Economics 101, that is deemed a recession. Now we can see some situations where a drop in GDPs can lead to deep recessions, but you have to look at underlying factors that drive GDP to make sure that how strong are other indicators that support GDP. GDP is one indicator of how we measure the overall economy, the health. We also look at other aspects like labor market, we look at housing starts, we look at beyond GDP into consumer spending, we look at different aspects of it just to see how the overall health of an economy is. GDP shouldn't be undersold, but it shouldn't also be oversold of its importance. What drives GDP? Well, in Canada's particular case, and this is not what you're going to hear from the opposition party, Canada is a population of about between 35 and 36 million people. Let's just say 36 million for simplistic state, with probably a consumer marketplace of about 22 million. If you're a company investing, small, medium, or large size business, your customer base is limited. So that being limited, economies of scale come in terms of how can I reduce my cost or maximize my operations to maximize my volumes to customers. Well, if I only have so many customers I can expand to, I'm limited, right? So therefore I'm restricted to what I can do in terms of my pricing strategy and my ability to expand markets. That's why exports are so very important in Canada. They're also very critical to Canada. And exports are driven, as I mentioned, to other segments in Economics 101. And without exports, Canada would be in deep trouble because it wouldn't be able to provide its social programs, which are healthcare, education, money for infrastructure, if it didn't have a healthy economy driven by exports. So that's the first thing that drives GDP. The second thing is consumer spending. So what are people doing within their local conditions here? Are they able to spend a bit more money based on their household budgets, or are they impacted by poor policy decisions that you're going to be discussed by NDP or the Liberal Party, which is A, hiking CPP, or bringing cap and trade system, which pushes the cost of goods sold up in terms of what you're purchasing at the register by 8 to 10%, because with the carbon pricing that gets added to the cost. Or it's basically looking at different aspects of the way government in terms of corporations. If you're hiking corporation tax, they'll actually charge different prices to absorb or manage those taxations. Okay, so in essence, you need to understand that when these guys start talking about policies, any policy that impact is a tax, it's a tax. Taxes are not absorbed by businesses, they're passed on to the consumer via higher prices. If you don't think I'm right, then I suggest you may want to go look at and see the impact of what's happening carbon pricing out in BC, and you'll see that they've seen their prices go up the roof. And the way they've tried to offset that is they've reduced the personal income taxes, but it hasn't been enough to offset that. So if you're reducing the capacity for people to spend, then you're going to put pressure on your GDP. And that's something that's not discussed by Thomas Mulcair. He seems to think that Harper doesn't seem to understand it, and they keep talking about trickle-down economics. Trickle-down economics means if you get a lot of taxation and it flows down, people spend money. But there's no indication from when these people tell you that Harper's policies haven't basically supported the middle class. You're more than welcome to go out and read statements on the middle class in Canada, but you will find that Canada's got one of the best middle classes in the world when you compare it to its peers. Now, it doesn't change the fact that at a provincial level, that wherever Stephen Harper takes it, 85% of that's taken back through bad policies. But I think people need to put the policies and blame at the right government. It's easy to shoot the messenger, and I've seen this in business for 25 years, but you really need to go and shoot the processes. The other thing I want to talk quickly about here is government spending. Government spending is very critical. Most cases in Canada, we've got only one or two provinces that are either running a surplus or a balanced budget. Most of the other ones are in deficit and have huge debt situations. So that being said, that's going to put limitations in the amount of money they're going to be able to flow through the system to support the economy. Now, Ontario's case, they're putting a lot of money in infrastructure, but they're holding their own on salary increases for public sector workers. So that means they're losing value of that dollar, which also impacts that Mulcair never talks about impacts on wage growth and stagnation. Mulcair will tell you about private sector, talk about wage growth, but he will never say that some of that impacts basically driven by government. Let's talk about GDP. When we were looking at basically GDP this year, starting in January, we were about 1.65 trillion. Okay, and of that, we were about 500 billion related to goods producing, and 1.2 billion roughly of about service producing. So over the year, what's happening is the goods producing sector has seen a decline, okay, of about basically close to 16 billion in decline in that, and most of that's been driven by what's happening in the resource sector. We've seen about 7 billion GDP fell out of the resource sector due to low commodity prices and scale back of capacity. Okay, that's controls beyond Stephen Harper's control. There's a glut of oil in the market. Stephen Harper can't do much on the resource side of that. But that being said, there's some uptick expected on oil later on this year. Prices will not totally rebound, but there's some uptick in that. Manufacturing. Well, manufacturing is down, but there's a good indication why manufacturing is down. The U.S. itself was struggling in the very first probably 4 months this year. That impacts Ontario, Quebec, and some of the other areas where we've had huge manufacturing, especially in Ontario with automotive. There's a lot of plant shutdowns that kind of drove some of the GDP numbers down in manufacturing, but you won't again hear that because it's easy to blame Harper on that Harper's not diversified enough, he's not doing enough to support things. But in essence, he has things outside macro controls that he can't do anything. If the U.S. isn't growing or stagnated, basically that impacts our exports because 75%, or should be about 70% of all our exports go to the U.S. So if they've got sluggish growth, that's going to impact their exports, which is going to impact our GDP. The other thing you're going to notice here that the service sector has done quite well. And we've seen different issues with that service sector. And that means getting into basically retail side. People are spending money, and that's where we're seeing a lot of it from hospitality side to basically housing starts. The just distribution side's going up. Again, that's supporting the needs for consumer spending that we've seen year over year. It's grown between 1.5% to 2.2%, which has kind of helped buffer some of the impacts that we're seeing in the good producing area. But again, you will not hear that. What you'll hear from the opposition is household debt is up. Now, you can bring down and change taxation, but you can't force people to live by household budgets. You also can't force, when you've got bad policies that happen in Ontario with hydro rates, by poorly manage the grid upgrades by looking the more effective way to basically upgrade and replace the grids in a cost-effective way. But whether that meant using Hydro Quebec or Manitoba, that would have helped keep prices down or capped it, that would have helped consumers. But you're not going to hear that because power rates fall into the provincial level. It's just easy for the federal government, or in this particular case Mulcair and Trudeau, to blame Harper for everything. So that's what I wanted to highlight. The other thing I wanted to highlight here, just to show you the ratios. So basically, manufacturing is still one of the biggest pieces of goods producing. It's come down over the years, but we've changed a lot of things. It's become more advanced. And Stephen Harper has actually done a lot of good policies that support manufacturing. And if you don't believe me, you can actually go out to Jason Meyer's site, the Canadian Manufacturers Association. He will talk to you in great length about some of the policies that Stephen Harper's brought in to support manufacturing. If you look at basically real estate's been pretty consistent all year, and which makes sense because housing starts are still pretty strong. We're seeing good solid pricing in housing. If anything, we're seeing a bit low interest rates drive the pricing up again. You'll likely hear issues from Mulcair and Trudeau talk about housing and feeding into housing starts and feeding into household debt. But the reality is the government has little control that can they do over household debt. They can change some of the mortgage rules, but there's deep issues in terms of the whole processes, right? So don't believe every word you're going to hear from Mulcair or even Justin Trudeau when it relates to you going out buying property. Rules have to change, and that goes back to how we do proper market evaluations, and the banks need to be involved. So we kind of have to look at things from the speculators and all that. So that discussion should be asked out to very detailed questions to Justin Trudeau and to Thomas Mulcair. If they think there's an issue with household debt, how are you going to fix it? What policies you're going to bring in that you can control? Throw it back to them, because they need to be asked and called to task about why they feel they're better at handling the household debt. Now this CFB one is just to gauge you the barometer. It just looks at different things in terms of the business barometer. And if you look at certain things, natural resources, we're not surprised because we've seen low commodity prices that the business barometer area would be low there. But look at some of the areas that you're seeing. Agricultural looks pretty strong. Manufacturing, wholesale, retail. But look at where you're seeing some of it. Hospitality. You're seeing something like insurance, real estate, IT areas. So you're seeing some good signs in certain areas of the economies are doing better than others. And that's the good thing I wanted you to take out of this slide. Let's talk about balance of payments. The way a country measures itself is inflow and outflow of dollars. Okay, a country has to operate on hard currency. Okay, so if you're seeing a lot of outflow, that means you're seeing a lot of things from profits from foreign nationals going outside the country. You're seeing foreign direct investments going outside the country. You're seeing stock markets in terms of investments in foreign capital, because basically that's how money flows in and outflow. So when you hear the government talk about balanced payments, they're never going to give you specifics, because unless you're really a deep economist and understand exactly all the different capacity to it, they're just going to play the fear-mongering on things. I'm going to keep it pretty simple to kind of show you in a roundabout way what it really means in terms of the balance of payments. So you're seeing different things in this particular case: compensation, employee, direct investment, portfolio investments. So let me put it in a nutshell. Okay, on the inflows, any economy like developing resources, okay, needs capital coming in. So if we're seeing less capital investment coming in, and we are seeing that we're seeing that 25 to 30% less capital coming in due to delaying of projects in the oil sector, that will impact balance of payment, because that's foreign direct capital coming in from ExxonMobil, coming in from Shell, which is Royal Dutch, or coming in from China to help develop those resources. It can be also the mining sector, which we've seen nickel and other things fall out. So you need to be cognizant of that. If you're seeing part of it, a little less money coming in, that means they're not developing as much projects there. That's not Stephen Harper's fault. That's demand of what's required in the oil and business decisions as part of their return on investments. The other thing too that happens as well, Canada is a branch plant association. So in other words, we have foreign entities here of subsidiary U.S. companies. They flow that money out through dividend payouts to their foreign company. That's how they repatriate cash. So that's a normal flow of globalization. So if Thomas Mulcair thinks he can fix this overnight, then he needs to seriously understand how globalization works in terms of the outflow of cash, and how exports play a critical role in terms of this balance of payments. Now, what I also want to show you here is the deficits here, right? Like, you're looking at different aspects here from travel, goods, and services. So let me take a step back here now and put things in very much in perspective. Most of you have smart devices. Most of you have iPads. Most of you wear nice clothes. And as I mentioned, Economics 101, that impacts things. We're importing those goods in. We don't make them here. Now, if Thomas Mulcair seriously wants to bring down this gap, then he would have to come up with 4 or 5 significant policies. One is he'd have to expand exports. Well, how is he going to do that? He's made it quite clear that natural resources are not on the table. He's never supported Stephen Harper on development of natural resources. He says a lot of good words about sustainability of the resource management, but he never supports it. Second thing is, he should be looking at advanced manufacturing, or looking at ways to up our manufacturing and supporting in advanced areas in terms of technology. He has talked a bit about that, but he hasn't never provided significant details. The ag sector, he said very little on the ag sector, yet wheat, rye, other food products are very critical to expand out to areas like Saudi Arabia and that. He hasn't talked about aerospace exports. He's had people speak out about things about military shipments to Saudi Arabia, but yet he doesn't say anything how that benefits and reduces brings the exports, we export out, brings that hard currency in, reduces our balance of payments. He doesn't talk about that. He doesn't talk about any rules around pension funding or investments in terms of that foreign ownership that much, does he? He talks a lot of things, but he never connects all the dots together. He's very dangerous, because without truly understanding how policy works in terms of drives cash, and you're never going to be able to fix things or make a proper decision. He's dangerous. And I hate to say this to people, and I hate to plead with people, but if you bring in an NDP government, this balance of payment will actually worsen, because he won't get the investment in, because people aren't going to invest in an environment that's high tax, high regulated. He won't get the local manufacturing expanding, because they don't need the capacity. Their domestic market's only so big. So this guy really doesn't get it about economics and what it takes to compete. It's not surprising, because he's a career politician that spent his whole time playing politics at the provincial government, that he never really took a business course to understand what it takes to compete. The other thing is, he's listening to unions like Uniform talk to him, who basically, their goal isn't about productivity, their goal isn't about anything. Their goal is to throw money at a problem. But if you don't fix the input cost, don't fix the environment where it's basically makes Canada competitive, then you're not going to bring in that dollar for investment. And the other thing too is, you can't stop companies, Canadian companies, that are expanding mining operations in Chile. That you can't. It's part of globalization. So that's part of the outflow of foreign direct investment. The reason why I'm making these statements is because there's a lot of information, misinformation being out there, whether it's from Mulcair or Justin Trudeau. It's one thing to say that Harper's failed on his policies, but it's another thing to come up with anything of substantive that's better than his policies. And nothing that the NDP or the Liberal Party is proposing is any better. The Liberal Party in the past, when they ruled, they basically rolled conservative policies, whether they were trade agreements or strong exports to the U.S. They've never really looked at diversification. So the NDP has never really ruled anywhere in terms of the federal level. But they have at a provincial level, and they've been nothing but a nightmare. If you want a good example, go look at Manitoba, because those are the policies you will see at a federal level. This was to kind of try to introduce you to basically balance of payments, to kind of give you an understanding that concepts or comments by Trudeau Mulcair at a high level mean nothing unless you go into the details.